As the temps start rising, I feel the familiar urge to refresh my closet, but I don't want to waste money on pieces I'll only wear once or for just one season. Thankfully, Quince changes that. Their clothes are timeless, lightweight, and far more elevated than anything else at this price. It finally feels like my wardrobe matches my standards. The best part is that Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices and premium fabrics and finishes, so you get to look good while feeling good. I'm pretty excited that I have upgraded my athleisure wardrobe for this summer. I bought a sweatshirt and a pair of wide-leg flow pants that are two of the softest items I own, and I plan to live in them. So join me in giving your summer closet an upgrade with Quince. Go to quince.com/POTC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/POTC to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/POTC.
Anything that you do that involves pausing, asking yourself what you need, and then doing something to try to meet that need, that's an act of self-compassion. And several studies by some researchers here in Australia have shown that autistic people have lower levels of self-compassion than non-autistic people and higher levels of self-criticism. And we also know that ADHDers have that higher level of self-criticism and lower self-compassion too. And so we're starting from a foundation of being very hard on ourselves. And this book is written for everyone. It's not a therapist book. It's written for any autistic person or ADHD or family member or friend.
That was Jennifer Kemp on Psychologists Off the Clock.
We are 5 experts in psychology here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, and author of Act for Burnout, Act Daily Journal, and the Act Daily Card Deck.
From America's Heartland, I'm Dr. Emily Edlin, a clinical psychologist based in Chicago, Illinois, and author of Autonomy Supportive Parenting.
I'm Yael Schoenbrunn, a clinical psychologist, faculty at Brown University, author of Work, Parent Thrive, and a biweekly newsletter on relationships.
Calling in from Vienna, Austria, I'm Michael Herold, ACT coach, confidence trainer, and author of an upcoming book on being a better conversationalist and making friends.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, The Big Book of ACT Metaphors, and Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Hello. This is Debbie, and I have a conversation I'm bringing you today about neurodivergence with Jennifer Kemp, who has a terrific skills workbook for autistic people and ADHDers and other types of neurodivergence. And I invited Emily on to do the co-host intro with me today because, Emily, you have expertise. You've done episodes in the past related to neurodivergence, and I know you have worked in this area in your clinical practice.
Yes, I have. And so I really was excited to listen to this discussion, and it brought up so much as I was listening. You know, one thing I was thinking about is how many kids I've worked with who, first of all, I can see the signs and I make a referral for testing. Then they go through the testing process and then they end up being diagnosed with autism or ADHD. And then the parents realize, I think something's going on with me. And so it's the child's evaluation and diagnosis process that then opens up the parents' self-awareness of their own executive functioning and neurodivergence. And then they have their process. So it's kind of been an interesting thing to watch in my clinical practice.
Well, and I only work with adults in my practice, and I've seen more of that where people have a late diagnosis. It was something that was overlooked along the way. And sometimes I have been surprised when I've seen that happen because I wasn't necessarily picking up on things. But a lot of times people do find it really helpful and validating because it makes sense of things, of course.
Right.
So as I've been learning about this, first of all, I found myself feeling a little bit nervous about doing this interview because I don't necessarily have all the right language. For instance, we used to have a person first way of talking about these things. So person with autism. But now there's like a reclaiming of this identity and a less pathologizing model. And so a lot of people prefer, as Jennifer does, an identity first. So say an autistic person. And, it's almost like, how much do we want to worry about the semantics to the point where we're, a nervous wreck about this? But I actually think it's important. And I'm trying to learn this.
Well, and that's what I loved about this episode and having this on Psychologist Off the Clock is I think that as the understanding of neurodivergence is becoming more mainstream, we still have so much awareness to build in our consciousness about what it's really like for those of us who are neurotypical. It's really helpful to understand what it's like to not be neurotypical and just engage with this neurotypical world and what the demands that it takes and the energy and the effort. And I think we just, it's like when you swim in the sea, you don't see the water, right? And so it's really helpful to hear some of Jennifer's very specific examples of her personal experience and in her professional work of how that mismatch can be so draining and stressful. And the more that all of us can understand it, I think the more compassionate we can all be. And then it is a better world for all of us, no matter our neurodivergence.
Well, and I do think that that's been eye-opening for me as well. I think that one thing this work has made me realize is how I had some assumptions or just some ways of thinking about things that were based a little bit more on that pathologizing model of neurodivergence and neurodiversity. And to challenge that a little bit has been really a mindset shift for me that I've found really helpful.
Yeah, I really think what listeners will take away from this episode is those who are neurodivergent and identify as autistic, ADHD, or other type of neurodivergent will feel validated. And then I think neurotypical listeners will learn so much about what it's like to go through the world with neurodivergence and just becoming more compassionate. One thing that really caught my attention is when Jennifer would give examples of being a really busy mom with all these demands and how hard it is with her neurodivergent brain to organize it all and keep track of it all and remember everything. And I'm thinking, well, that's hard for me. And as far as I know, I'm neurotypical and I'm overwhelmed and feel like I'm drowning. And so to remember, to have that extra layer of effort and energy that all of that would take, it helps just my own compassion for all of us going through whatever we're going through in our lives.
Well, yes, I agree completely. And I'm so glad you said that because I think for our listeners, regardless of where you are in terms of neurodiversity, neurodivergence, what would the word be? Neurotypicality?
I would just say in the realm of neurodiversity, because that covers neurodivergence and neurotypical.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I love it. So for all of you listening, we hope you enjoy the episode. My guest, Jennifer Kemp, is an autistic and ADHD clinical psychologist practicing in Adelaide, Australia. Using a neurodiversity-affirming approach, Jennifer weaves together acceptance and commitment therapy, behavioral and compassion-focused approaches with her own lived experience of neurodivergence to help her clients improve their mental health and develop greater self-compassion, self-acceptance, and pride in their neurodivergent identity. She's been on the podcast before to talk about her first book, The ACT Workbook for Perfectionism. That was episode 226, so check it out. And today we're going to talk about her latest book, which she co-authored with Monique Mitchelson, The Neurodivergent Skills Workbook for Autism and ADHD. Cultivate compassion, live authentically, and be your own advocate. Jennifer, welcome back. It's great to see you.
Hi, Debbie. I'm really pleased to be back on this podcast. I just really loved the recording we did last time. I had so many beautiful comments come through about it. So I'm really happy to be back here.
Oh, yeah, we had a great feedback on that perfectionism episode, and I have recommended it to a lot of people. So I appreciate it. And our topic today and your new book, I'm really excited to dive into, in part because we're just talking offline about how this is not necessarily that something I think I learned just enough to get by in graduate school about this, and obviously have had experience, personal experience and experience with clients, related to neurodivergence. But it's something where I am still learning so much. And I think a lot of people are. And so I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you for my own learning and also for what we can share with the world.
Yeah, it is an area that we're all trying to upskill on. I think over the last really just sort of 3 years or so, I've been doing quite a deep dive into this. Obviously, and a book came out of that. But I guess that's how I get to know something is I set myself a goal, write a book, now learn everything you can about it. But honestly, also I learn an enormous amount from my clients too every day. I think I would have had in 8 years of psychology training or something like that, maybe one lecture on autism, and it would have been on a child developmental course or something. That would have been the sum total of what we learned. And all through this sort of deficit focus of, these poor children, this sort of, tragedy narrative that's been running for such a long time, that autistic people have these huge problems and we need to fix them. That's kind of been the approach. And I think we've really shifted that now. We understand that both autism and ADHD are actually quite common, and as common amongst girls and women as amongst boys and men, and that they look very different in different people and can often be really quite hidden and masked and compensated for. Particularly ADHDers put a lot of work into compensating for their challenges. And that's certainly what I did. And we now approach it as this is a set of differences. This is where about maybe 5% of the population would meet the criteria for ADHD and maybe 2 to 3 autism. So quite a few of us out there. And where we have different neurology, and that's in our whole bodies. And it means we respond to and interact and understand the world differently. But the challenges are that the world isn't designed for people in any minority group. It's designed for the majority. So it creates a lot of challenges. And you would have seen that in your autistic and ADHD clients. So much sort of stress in trying to interact with the world that is just not accommodating those differences. So, yeah, things have really shifted.
Well, and I think even the way that we think and talk about neurodiversity has changed. And I'm very appreciative of the tone that your book takes in terms of being so affirming. And I was wondering, how would you like to hear people talk about this? Could you just say a little bit more about this new way of looking at neurodiversity and neurodivergence in terms of a less stigmatizing place to be?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in some ways there's been a little push too far in the opposite direction at times. I personally don't subscribe to the superpower model. I find that that's kind of invalidating of people's actual genuine difficulties. So I look at the experiences that my clients have of the world, and they definitely bring some really deep strengths to that, but not strengths that necessarily always serve them in the work that they're doing or their deep knowledge in different niches or in their interest isn't always something they can make into a career, or not that they wouldn't necessarily want to, doesn't necessarily help them achieve their goals. If it does, if you can align your deep interests, I've been really fortunate that my sort of longest term interest we call that in autism a monotropic interest, a sort of narrower but deeper focus for interests. Mine is psychology. So I've been really lucky. It was a really lucky break to sort of have picked that straight out of school. And it's a lifetime passion. And I've absorbed myself in all sorts of different areas of that. And I have other passions too. But understanding these strengths aren't necessarily always superpowers either. ADHDers and the vast majority of autistic people would also be ADHDers, over 80%, most likely. have real difficulties with executive functioning, getting organized, planning, decision-making, tracking and managing time, maintaining attention, getting overwhelmed by constant distractions. Like this is a hard thing to manage, particularly in our society. There's been a recent study that's shown that some of those differences would have actually been an evolutionary advantage. If you were like a nomadic society, that kind of endless need for novelty and exploration would have really supported your community in finding new resources, finding new opportunities. Now, when we're supposed to be writing that essay and we've got a million other things going on and distractions, it's really hard. So particularly if that essay is boring and just getting yourself to do it is really hard. So we're really understanding that there's this sort of middle ground between these problems, some of which, are the whole way that our kind of body is structured and set up, that creates difficulties. But the bigger problem is the mismatch between that and our society. The superpower narrative, it taps into that whole Rain Man kind of stereotype of autistic people have to have this, incredible savant gift. And, most people don't. That's very rare, actually. We want to be walking this kind of middle line of saying, wow, you're different. These differences have some strengths and they also create difficulties for you because of the mismatch in what you're trying to achieve and how the world is set up.
This reminds me of how often, if you think about a relationship, like a marriage, for instance, sometimes the personality differences or the, quirks that we love about the person are also the challenges. And I think it maps onto this idea that, there's maybe benefits and challenges to some of these unique features that, obviously varies so much person to person. And you need to be in an environment that is accepting and, not so stigmatizing and expecting you to mold yourself. And so, it's quite complicated. I could see what you're saying, that maybe the superpower model isn't quite capturing the full picture. So it might be a step in the right direction, but it's also not quite that simple. Maybe.
No, it's absolutely not that simple. Yeah. And I'm, as a therapist, really not wanting to minimize the very real challenges my clients are facing. And they're coming to me because they're feeling paralyzed often and completely burnt out and unable to pursue their goals and so stuck, and have developed, after a lifetime of undiagnosed autism and ADHD, all these different ways of coping and a lot of mental health problems. So there's a much higher burden of mental health problems in late diagnosed autistic and ADHD people, and very high rates of trauma experienced in that group as well. So just if people are wondering, and I certainly have, whether, do I want to give my child this label? That's such a common thing. I don't want my child to be stigmatized. I don't want them to have this label. We won't tell them, or sometimes we get them assessed, but we won't tell them the outcome. I've got to say that the research is really clear that the earlier, the better in terms of outcomes. The earlier that child has an understanding that they are different to their peers, that they do have certain needs, and that people around them, their teachers, their family, can accommodate those things, the better the long-term outcomes. Because it's the late diagnosed people generally who are picking up in therapy now, like really with lots of overlapping difficulties and physical health problems as well.
Hey everybody, it's Jill here, and I am super excited to announce that I will be speaking at one of the largest and truly most inspiring and meaningful psychotherapy conferences we have here in the US, the Psychotherapy Networker Conference. Other speakers include Esther Perel, John Kabat-Zinn, Ramani Durvasula, David Kessler, and so many more. I am just thrilled and honored to be among this esteemed faculty. The conference is being held March 20th to the 23rd in Washington, D.C., and if you register now, you can get early bird rates and save up to 40%. Plus, you can get an additional $50 off when you use the code SIM50. That's SYM50. So go to our website, offtheclocksite.com, and click on our books and offers page and register today.
So what you're doing with your book, it is a skills workbook specifically for autistic people and ADHDers. Yeah. And I imagine it was a challenge, right? To decide what are you going to include in this book? What skills are helpful? And also with an eye toward that more, neurodiversity affirming lens. And so how did you approach that challenge?
Yeah, it was actually a really great process to go through with Monique because she is such an experienced therapist in this space. And it was really cool to see that when we started talking about like the experiences that our clients have, that we were having exactly the same like experiences. So when we, at that kind of higher level, putting the book together, there was a bit of shuffling, but that fell into place fairly quickly, really, because in the book we knew we needed to lay out kind of what is autism, what is ADHD, and why these are sort of really belong to the kind of same spectrum of differences, and have people really understand themselves. The first step is knowing you're neurodivergent and really understanding what that means. That's the first step towards recovery, which is why I'm now spending so much time working with professionals on that piece. Like, because if you can really help your client understand their differences and where they get stuck, they start making decisions straight away, right? And we can all, like, as soon as we know what is, why we're getting stuck, we can start to find workarounds, find other ways, find other strategies, right? So putting that together, that was clear. And every client that comes in for us is already in burnout. So it was very clear that burnout had to be right at the start of the book, because everything that we do after that really helps with burnout. So understanding autistic and ADHD burnout is this deep tiredness and fatigue, and it comes with much worsened sensory sensitivities, sleep, physical health, mental health. It affects every aspect of your life. And I can say that I hit handing this book draft in, Debbie. By the time this went in, I was in deep burnout. I'm sure I've had, depressive episodes in my life. And I wonder, looking back now, whether they were burnout, some of those as well. This was a whole different level in terms of my physical health. And I'm still recovering very carefully over a year now, having good days and bad days. So all of the changes that you need to make off the back of that realization that you're in burnout, they affect kind of every part of your life. So we knew that we needed to talk about emotion regulation skills. There are particular areas. So emotion regulation is an executive function, and executive functioning problems is what defines ADHD. But most autistic people also have executive functioning problems too. So this is why ADHD just really struggle with experiences of hurtful rejection, and really struggle to recover from these things, find their big emotions, perhaps act out or use substances or like to manage these things. And so that was a key piece. We knew that most of our clients have trouble getting stuff done. So we needed to talk about executive functioning strategies, sort of achieving your goals. We wanted to talk about relationships, because you can't unmask and be yourself unless you feel safe. So we needed to talk about really like neurodivergent relationship skills, which are kind of like different, right? Like acknowledging and accepting that you have different preferences to the neurotypical non-autistic people, working with those preferences. Need to advocate for yourself and ask for help, and eventually work towards sort of being able to unmask and be yourself, because the more you can unmask, the better your well-being will be, because it is just so draining. So we could see all of those. It was then like within each of those, that was where the challenge was. Like, because there's not a lot being done specifically in this space, or there's lots of books coming out now. There's some great ones coming out. really like what skills would be affirming in executive functioning, what skills would be, how do we discuss and explore the differences in relationships, and how can people build friendships that are safe. So yeah, that was there was a lot of work in there, a lot of research. This is a very well researched book.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we'll dive in, I think, specifically to some of those things that you mentioned as the conversation goes on. And I really think you did a nice job of giving people practical, concrete skills and information that will help them in so many ways, and doing it in that sort of caring, compassionate, neuro-affirming kind of way, right? It's not pathologizing. It's very much like about having a good life and being kind toward yourself. So I want to go back to the burnout thing. And I think, I wrote a book on ACT for Burnout, and I feel pretty good about the book. I really do. Like I look at it sometimes, I'm like, wow, I wrote that. That's cool. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I know that feeling.
Have one regret, which was that I didn't include a section specifically on that. And that's really just because I learned about it actually from you, because you put out like an e-book or something like that a while ago. And it was after I had turned in my manuscript. And I was like, of course. I mean, this is something I didn't address, but it makes so much sense that there's something like you were saying about being in a minority group of any type where you're working extra hard because of mainstream society not being set up for you. So could you just say a little bit more about why there's this risk for burnout and what you've seen around that?
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to getting into your book as well. I thought, oh wow, it's such the timing of those two things was really cool. And I'm sure that a lot of in applying ACT skills, which is what we've done in our chapter on burnout, we really talk about how burnout comes from trying to live up to expectations that are essentially not designed for you and not going to be easy for you to achieve. So for example, and I've worked as a management consultant in a big four consulting firm. After I finished psychology, I sort of had a whole corporate career before coming back in this direction. And you're trying to perform and behave in a way that fits in with the sort of culture of this organization, which I think looking back, I was not really a great cultural fit. And I found it really hard, and I would hit these situations where I felt a deep sense of outrage at people's behavior, which is very autistic of me. People were not being honest or fair. That's a big beef autistic people often have, because we have a very strong sense of social justice. It's pretty pervasive amongst autistic people. So you're trying to fit. I'm trying to fit myself into this culture, and I do think it was after I worked at this firm that I had this huge depressive episode, which I think was definitely some burnout in that as well, from really a very high level of masking, trying to hide my kind of differences and button my lip and not speak out because a more senior staff person would rebuke me for that. I never realized until recently how hyperactive I am. I think people who know me would be like, oh, yeah, but for me, it was just totally normal. I'm always doing something. I can't really sit still. I have a lot of trouble just sitting still and watching a movie, and restless, if nothing else. So I was in a meeting where we were trying to map out the parts of a project, for example, in a flow chart. Don't remember any details at all. And at some point I had an idea, and I got up and I must have just taken the pen out of someone's hand and said, what about this? I started drawing, and I got pulled into a meeting afterwards and really dressed down for that, because I'd taken the pen out of my manager's hand and then just told them what I think. And that hierarchical thing was well, I was there to solve the problem and I was there to I've got an idea I want to express. And I didn't remember doing it. It's did I really? I have no memory of actually, I remember writing on the board, but I have no memory of just taking the pen out of his hand. So he was furious with me. So trying to sort of fit into that environment meant really suppressing a lot of my differences and performing neurotypicality, I guess, in that. And it's extremely burdening. And we're also, at the same time, living in a society where there's often a sensory overload. I do have sensory sensitivities. Not all autistic people have huge sensitivities, although most of us would. Some people have hyposensitivities. So just want to acknowledge that group of people who find kind of everything kind of meh. Like that's a hard experience as well. And so, I'm working under fluorescent lights. I was traveling interstate to travel. I lived in Hong Kong for 3 months with this company, working out of a hotel room. Like all of this takes a toll on the body that I had no idea was going on. So trying to do all of those things and to sort of fit this corporate mold of a management consultant was really draining. And so whatever the context, burnout happens when there's this mismatch between those expectations and you're still trying to achieve them. One of the key things, I'll be curious to see how this marries up with your book. One of the key things to do is to start challenging those expectations. Like really, do I always have to have a neat and tidy home? I'm expecting myself to always be on top of the washing, my kitchen bench to be wiped down. Is this the right environment for me to work? Is this a good fit for me? So starting to challenge and unpack those expectations, these sort of neuronormative expectations really is so important in burnout. And they just have such a toll on the body and your energy levels and everything. I think I more or less answered your question there, Debbie.
Yeah. Chronic stress leads to exhaustion. And I think it reminds me of that concept they talk about, code switching, where you have to sort of deny a part of yourself or the way you would normally act if you're being true to yourself in order to fit into this group. Yeah. And just how exhausting that can be over the course of time. And I think that's a really good point. How can we have a world in which there's a bigger range of the way that people can be, and what a relief that would be to people. If I was in charge of the world, that's one of the things I would change, just more, acknowledgement of some of these cultural expectations.
So code switching, literally that having to switch and communicate in a different way, it's exactly what we're talking about in masking with autistic people. And also in trans communities, passing, there's a sort of a level of, so there's an overlap with these terms. I'm not an expert in all of these terms, so I could definitely stand corrected. This minority experience that is part of this daily burden of minority stress. And being autistic, you don't know you're autistic, but you just know that you have to work so much harder to fit in. So why is it I'm working so hard on making and keeping these friendships? It just seems so easy to everyone else. It's not an obvious thing we might even be aware of. And for me, when I first did the autism screeners, my scores were really, really low because I was in my late 40s at the time and I had been masking my entire life. So I didn't know any other. That's just my automatic behavior. So I'm like, no, I really enjoy going to parties. Now if I answered, I'm like, not so much occasionally. So, the way you answer those questions when you sort of actually really appreciate who you are, is quite different.
I want to dive a little bit deeper into that concept of masking, actually, because you've mentioned that a couple of times. And I think maybe some people aren't as familiar with that concept. And it's interesting what you're saying, almost as if you were masking so much that you were masking to yourself to a degree. So tell us a little bit, give us a little masking 101. What does that mean and what's the toll of it?
Yeah. So there's autistic masking and there's sort of 3 parts to it. There's that suppressing your differences. I've referred to this already. So just trying to, like if you want to move your hands a lot, but you realize that it looks kind of weird, you sort of sit with your quiet hands, or it might be like holding eye contact and making sure you hold that even though it feels a bit uncomfortable. Just sort of trying to suppress any differences that people might think are odd or unusual. So that's sort of the suppressing side, often called masking as well. There's a camouflaging part of that. So this is where you're in a social situation and it feels a bit performative. You might actually even pre-prepare what you're going to say when you get there, or have some witty comments. You might use quotes or in-jokes that sort of fit in I've had clients say things to me like, in my friendship group, Joe, just everyone seems to like him. He just gets on with everyone. So I just try to be like Joe. So there's an element of kind of whether you're playing like performing a role that is someone you know, or it could be a fictional character or something like that. So it's quite exhausting. Suppressing your differences is definitely tiring, but there's a performative element of that. An example for me would be going to like some school social events with parents that I don't really know, and I have to do a lot of small talk and I have to show up a certain way. So there's a real element of performance, and I find those things really quite hard work. Like not always, sometimes, there's a group there that I do connect with, but quite often those feel really draining. And the third part of masking is compensatory strategies, and ADHDers absolutely do this. It's an ADHD for me. This is trying to make up for my difficulties. So I'm someone who, if it isn't in my diary, it doesn't happen. And I'm wary to say that because a lot of the terrible advice given to ADHD is things like just use a diary. But when you're in burnout or executive functioning overload, it does require a level of organization to use a diary consistently. And that's not accessible by a lot of people. But for me, I would have things in my diary like pick up my children from school. You would think that might be something that, they're both at school and I pick them up at 3:30 every day. That would be a thing that I would remember, but I would still put it in my diary because it would mean that at that time I had to leave and I'd have a reminder there because I could lose track of time. So for ADHDers and autistic people, those compensatory strategies are exhausting and they contribute hugely to burnout. They're a part of that masking that's just trying to keep on top of everything, whether it's like for mums with small children, you're carrying. We talk a lot about that mental load that you carry running a household. It's that also having a tendency to forget. So having to constantly write lists, having to constantly go over and over and over it in your head, repeat the list. Do you ever go to the supermarket just for like you need 3 things? And you're like, I need milk and eggs and bread, milk, eggs, bread, milk, eggs, bread, milk. You have to say it the whole way. Otherwise you've forgotten it when you got there. If it's more than 2 things, I have to write it down. Usually actually I'll write it down if it's one thing. So yeah, that it's a huge mental load as well as that the sort of burden on like performing how you hold your body, the body language you're giving off, trying to look interested when you're not really interested, all of these little nuanced behaviors. So yeah.
I had a client once who was diagnosed later in life, and she said that she had trained herself to like make eye contact and to hold it for a certain amount of time. And she didn't realize until she got the diagnosis how hard she was working to do the eye contact thing. But she had trained herself for decades to do that. And all of a sudden realized, wow, that's very exhausting to be, hold eye contact for 10 seconds or whatever. And, it's just one of those things she probably didn't even really realize she was doing anymore.
Yeah, you don't. I was the same. What was one of the questions in the screeners? Do you have problems holding eye contact? I was like, no, not a problem for me. And I haven't actually spoken to anyone about this, but I certainly notice now that there are differences in eye contact. So someone who I know really well, eye contact is really easy. Someone that I don't know really well, I won't look at them. I'll kind of be just like chatting, but I'll do a lot of looking away. And when I'm talking about myself, I almost always look away. I can't hold eye contact while I'm talking about myself. So when I'm with clients, I take notes and I draw diagrams. It helps me in my working memory to kind of have a little bit of a list of like what's going on and like, just maybe mapping it out for myself and I share it with the client. But if I'm doing self-disclosure, I'm looking down and I look at them. I know my clients really well now and I'm looking at them when they're talking. Sometimes when I'm thinking, I'm looking down and I'm processing when I'm not looking. It's actually easier to process when I'm not looking. But there's actually a lot more differences in my eye contact than I'd ever kind of realized. And eye contact is one of those neuronormative goals that people set in some forms of therapy. And like teaching children to hold eye contact. The same as like it's called quiet hands. Like you're directly teaching that child to mask. So you're directly adding to their burden. And like, it's easier for me to process when I'm not looking at you in the eyes. So if I have to look at you in the eyes, like if I was at school and I had to look at the teacher in the eyes the whole time, I would find it quite hard to process what they were saying. That whole like, look at me when I'm talking to you. Actually, you're listening better when you're not looking. If you want me to listen to you, I don't need to be looking. So it can be really harmful, some of those things, actually, teaching children. Like in the Australian Indigenous culture, eye contact is not something that you give to people you don't know at all. And I have been amongst Indigenous people and felt comfortable in that space with them, but they're not looking at me in the eye. We're next to each other. And that's normal, acceptable cultural difference. So it's really white Western culture that says eye contact is a good thing.
And this is where I personally am learning so much, because I think we just take some of these things for granted and there's a lot of cultural context to it. And so to me, it's helpful to stop and think about some of these things. And I'm hoping people, as they're listening, will just start to, think about some of this in some slightly different ways.
It's a process, right? We've just got to be unpacking for ourselves, I think. Don't expect yourself to know it all at once. You're talking to a client or working on something in yourself and you're thinking, hang on a second. Like just that sort of general challenging of those assumptions. It's an ongoing process.
This is a good segue because I want to talk about self-compassion and self-acceptance, which are major components of the skills in the workbook, and you draw from compassion-focused therapy. Why is this important? Why is a self-compassion approach really necessary here? And I don't know if you might have some examples either from your own life or your work with clients where people can practice getting more self-compassion skills.
Yeah, sure. Self-compassion is at the heart of all those chapters that I talked through. It's all wrapped in self-compassion, all of it, and self-acceptance. Understanding your strengths and difficulties is a foundation for self-acceptance. So you can actually go, I'm really shit at this, so I'm going to get someone to help me. Like that's a very self-compassionate act. When we're writing the book, we're thinking about self-compassion from the broadest perspective on it, really. So anything that you do that involves sort of pausing, asking yourself what you need, and then doing something to try to meet that need, that's an act of self-compassion. And several studies by some researchers here in Australia, several studies have shown that autistic people have lower levels of self-compassion than non-autistic people and higher levels of self-criticism. And we also know that ADHDers have that higher level of self-criticism and lower self-compassion too. And so we're starting from a foundation of being very hard on ourselves. And this book is written for everyone. It's not a therapist book. It's written for any autistic person or ADHD or family member or friend. Right from the start, it's that like, I know who I am. I know how I'm different. I know what I need. And I'm going to take some steps to do that. Now, those steps aren't easy. Sometimes they might be like, I know that I'm feeling overwhelmed. I'm just going to go for a walk for 20 minutes. Now, sometimes that's easy and sometimes that isn't, right? Like I remember being a mom of a 3 and a 5-year-old and couldn't just go for a walk, leave the house. I couldn't leave them unattended for too long. So I didn't get those breaks that I needed and I would get completely overwhelmed. As you work through your life, sometimes you can find those gaps. Maybe when I was working, I could just take 20 minutes in the car to decompress before I go in and pick up the kids. Or maybe I can listen to some relaxing music after they go to bed or do some stretches that feel comfortable, good for me. Or maybe what I need is to zone out on my phone for a while and stop beating myself up for that. It also being creative about how you meet those things. So a lot of psychology is based on this assumption that, if we're avoiding something, we should be. And ACT, I think, can fall into this trap. If you have social anxiety and you're feeling anxious about going out, and so you cancel and you stay home, in ACT, a traditional approach would be, okay, let's work on like making room for those big feelings and going out even in the presence of, right? And you would know with your work in burnout, sometimes actually you just need to stay home and rest. That's actually okay. And if you start to understand yourself and you understand why it's so exhausting and anxiety provoking going out, is because we go to loud pubs and bright lights and everyone's talking at once and I can't track the conversation and I'm masking a lot and it's really exhausting. And I know when I get home, I'll be completely wasted for the next day. No wonder I'm feeling anxious about going. It's actually intensely uncomfortable for me. So being creative around this, I still want my value of connecting with friends might be, I'm going to pick like the one or two friends I feel most comfortable with. Maybe we can play games online together. And that works for me because I have had a busy week. I don't want to go out and I can stay cozy and comfy at home. This is a valid form of social interaction. So we do need to sort of, as psychologists, therapists, challenge some of those expectations. Actually, how could you, socialize in a way that works best for you? How could you meet that value of connecting with people?
Yeah, I really appreciate, because you have chapters on safe, supportive relationships and connecting in ways that feel authentic and acknowledging, that there's not a one size fits all model for these kinds of things, right? And I just really appreciate what you're saying about, we don't have to frame all of that as avoidance, right? Like if you choose not to go to the party, sometimes it's like you just intentionally choose that to recover. And that's a very valid and okay thing. It's conscious choice. So along the lines of, what you were saying earlier about self-criticism, I'll just tell the listeners really quickly, chapter 5 is called Stop Beating Yourself Up and Get Things Done. That was one of my most personally relevant chapters. And you cited in the book Casey Davis, who's been on the podcast before, to talk about, sometimes we get very moralizing about, I'm supposed to do this and I have this pile of laundry and this pile of mail. And
I love her book. And the only book I've ever seen that has, she's highlighted all the key passages. So you can just read end to end the book just by reading these small, bold passages and get all the key messages in like 20 minutes.
Yeah, she purposely writes it so that you can just digest it easily. I know, it's fantastic. Yeah.
I admire
And there are practical skills in your book, right? For that. Yeah, there are some things we will want to get done. And so how do we do that? And how do we do that when we maybe face some of these challenges? And so there's so many really practical tips. And I really love the way that you have these chapters that are directly relevant to people's lives. So, you mentioned earlier that sometimes people may, as they're aware of some of their own challenges and some of the, unique features of themselves and their particular neurodivergence, they might want some accommodations, but maybe not be aware of them, especially if they're later diagnosed. What advice would you give someone who maybe is new to this and isn't sure how to ask for accommodations or what accommodations they need? And I know that's big. You can't obviously speak to every single person, but just some general thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think I'm always aware of my relative level of privilege when we have this conversation, because there's many of my clients, they are relying on their work, like paycheck to paycheck. And so asking for accommodations in the workplace, for example, is something that if they felt it could risk their employment in any way is just not possible. Ultimately, when we're trying to help people move towards self-compassion, it's easy to say maybe you need a different job. And I'd like to think that would be possible for some people, perhaps more possible than we realize. And it's not always, right? So I think you need to sit back and do a little bit of an evaluation of obviously you sort of weigh this up. Some of the things that you can ask for, you may be able to ask without disclosing your neurotype. If you feel also that's once you've either self-identified or been formally diagnosed. There's a lot of barriers to being formally diagnosed. Once you know you're autistic or an ADHD, there may be specific things, like you don't have to tell anyone. Like there's no obligation. Sometimes we feel like this moral imperative. There is not.
Mm-hmm.
No one needs to know unless it's right for you. So you might go into your boss and say, I just find it, when we have those meetings in that open space, I just find it really hard to hear you. Could we have those in this meeting room instead? And that just might be a small accommodation that you could make that would make it easy for you to focus. Or I'm finding that I'm more tired towards the end of the day. I'm wondering whether we could reschedule these meetings for the mornings when I'm feeling, fresher, and then I can structure my day around it. Or could we have an agenda for these? Like meetings are just an example, for these, because it just really helps me like focus when I know what we're going to be covering.
Yeah.
So there's lots of little things you potentially could ask for that don't require unmasking. Having said that, and if you've read Devon Price's book, I was nearly late for this podcast because I was reading his latest Medium blog. So if you've read Unmasking Autism, which is a really big seller, it's an excellent book. He talks a lot about radical unmasking. And I do think that there's something like really powerful and pragmatic in that, rather than sort of holding this knowledge as this huge secret or just telling a few people. Sometimes like just saying it and people go, oh, okay. Like there's nowhere to go with that. So just saying, look, and I've done this at like conferences and things like that when people are going, where we go for dinner? Like, let's go. We'll sort it out later. And I'm like, I'm too autistic for this uncertainty. Like we need to sort it out now. Like I'm not coping with this. And just sort of being able to say it in that kind of way, it's like, there's no comeback to that. I'm owning it. I'm getting it out there. And if you've got the ability to do that, that can actually be a really like beautiful and powerful choice, I think, because then you can actually just ask for what you need.
Yeah.
And this actually a lot of the changes you need don't have any negative impact on anyone else. Like just moving a meeting to a different room, it's a no-brainer, but you need it. So you can ask for it.
So first you have to identify what you need. And then just, in the book, you have some examples and kind of a list of things. You have some assertive communication skills. I had a friend recently, I'm not great about scheduling things in advance. And I had a friend recently who said, it would really help me if we could decide soon. So can we look at our schedules? And I was like, thank you, because that's not really in my nature, but I'm so happy to do that. And I think for her, it was like stressing her out that it was just hanging. And so I appreciated the directness, because I'm like, if it's up to me, I'll decide at the last minute. But she was like, I need to decide soon because I have a busy week. And I was like, yes, I will do that. I think it's great to identify, like, this is what's going to help relieve my stress or make things easier for me. And you can just ask for it. And the worst that could happen is they could say no. And, Yeah.
And I do still believe that generally people will try to accommodate that if they can. So your friend needed that. And so it can be amazing. Like actually asking for help is really, really hard though. Like asking for those accommodations, you do need to know what you need and to sort of work that out. And then asking is really hard. I think when you spent a lifetime kind of trying to fit in, and autistic people, we do have a reputation for being blunt, providing way too much context, deep diving on things. Like we communicate in a way that sometimes pisses other people off, right? So amongst each other, we're like, just say it. Just say it. Like you're not too blunt for me, so go for it. But so you can be really fearful that you'll say it wrong and upset people. If you can build that rapport, that's really helpful. But yes, you do have to evaluate the relative safety of that. And so learning those assertiveness skills is really important. Learning how to hold boundaries, because people pleasing such a huge problem. Like boundaries, saying no, those kinds of things, it's hard.
Well, in your book, you clearly care about changing some of these cultural and systemic, expectations and issues related to neurodivergence. So the last question I want to end on here, if you could change one thing in the world to just make life easier for autistic people and ADHDers, Is that too big of a question? What is one change you would like to see? You would most like to see in the world?
I think you said it earlier. I think if we could all accept that we were different and that being different is being different and celebrate that. We could stop trying to change autistic children and ADHD children to fit a certain mold and adapt the classroom and our homes for these children to make their lives better, to help them access education. So rather than trying to help the child avoid stigma by getting them to fit in, could we tackle the stigma? Could we say, hey, this kid needs to flap their hands and jump up and down to sort of burn off some energy here, or they need to be fidgeting, or they need clearly structured information. Can we just try and meet those needs rather than say, no, this is not how you learn. You have to learn like this. And then we're going to be raising a group of children who know they're different and know that that's absolutely fine. And I do look at sort of Gen Z and what are we up to now? Gen Alpha. And I think the world that many of them are growing up in, their understanding of diversity is so much different to it was for us. And I would love to just keep extending that. It includes neurodiversity, but it includes all sorts of diversity. Can't wait to see, fingers crossed, what the world looks like. I might not be around when they're in charge, It will be very different.
Well, you're doing your part. And I have to say, when my own kids talk about, their autistic classmates and that type of thing, I'm really surprised in a good way by how different it was than what I grew up with. And so I think there's some hope there, and really appreciate the work you're doing, Jennifer, in regard to this. And, so everyone who's listening, we can all get out there and fight the stigma in our own ways. And thank you again so much for joining us. It's really great to see you.
Yeah. It's been great. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review or contributing on Patreon.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our newsletter and connecting with us on social media.
We'd like to thank our podcast production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.